up and avoiding London because we're not allowed to do events in London, and only because they've got a very great events team. So we have the benefit of being close to London for a lot of the Monday night lectures and a lot of the events that they put on, but also we try and maintain our own sort of independence from that. So we try and put on events across the year which cover a whole range and spectrum of different activities. Sometimes they are talks from authors and academics about some of the books they're working. Sometimes they are academic talks, sometimes they are visits out to the field. And one of the things we're really interested in is to hear from you about what sort of events you would like us to put on for you in the South East region, because as a group of volunteers we only have a small amount of ideas of activities we can put on, and if we have 1,000 members across a region and we only get 20 people turning up to events, we're probably not quite hitting the button for what people want. So we're always interested to hear from people about the different types of events to put on. So I will I'll wait till afterwards now, but I will afterwards try and have a conversation with people about what they're interested in and what we can do over the next 12 months to try and zhuzh up a little bit the membership of our South East region and to put events on about. There is a whole range of events on the RGS website which is updated on a regular basis. And every time we put on an event, we try and get out in as much lead time as possible for people to register on and attend. And so yeah, that's a little bit about my pitch first of all from the RGS. I think I forgot to introduce actually who I was. So my name is James, and I'm the new chair of the South East region for RGS, and have just taken over from our colleague Henry, who stepped down as chair after quite a few years of leading. So this is our first opportunity to have a speaker come and talk to us under the new committee. So we're really excited to have Dr. Tom Sykes give a bit of an overview, probably half an hour or so, 40 minutes or so, about the new book he's written. How many people, I might be asking, you might be stealing your thunder already, but how many people have part read Tom's book? Brilliant. For those of you who hasn't, he's got a lovely stack of current and past books as well. So you are also under no obligation to purchase any of his books. But
early Christmas presents.
Early Christmas presents, yeah. Absolutely. I will admit I'm about a third of the way through.
Okay,
so
well that's.
The bit in your talk where I perk up again is where I then have got to in your narrative. So that's where I'm really paying attention.
Okay.
But no, Tom, the floor is over to you, and hopefully we can have a set of conversations afterwards, and hopefully an open discussion about any of the issues either in the book, Tom's journey so far, and some of the different activities you've come across. But Tom, over to you.
Thanks very much, James, and thanks to Mark as well, my two colleagues respectively from the RGS, who you've just heard a little bit about, and I'd encourage you to kind of get more involved, come to their events locally and nationally and online and virtually and so forth. And also to Mark, who's a colleague here at the University of Portsmouth. So I've been a fellow of the RGS for about a year and a half, but I've been teaching here for 15 years. So those are my kind of particular sort of track records for the different organisations that have helped to bring you this event tonight. I'm going to start off by reading a little bit, if that's all right, just to kind of give a bit of context. Right from the beginning of this book, it's called The Years of Travelling Anxiously, and I'll just sort of dive in and read a bit, and then I'll kind of, as an academic, I'm kind of addicted to slides. It's like my brain would stop working if I didn't have slides. So, but also it's something to look at other than me, which is a good thing generally. So I've got a few slides as was mentioned, and then I'm kind of eager to hear from you actually as much as anything else about your kind of take on this whole kind of phenomenon of travel anxiety, which apparently is a phenomenon. It's a thing, and I didn't even know that until I'd sort of started writing the book and sort of started investigating it and seeing what other people had to say about it. So the introduction is called What We Don't Know, We Know About Anxious Travel. I thought I'd learned, grown, don't we all? We cling to these stories of progress in both society and our personal lives. From birth, we're fed maxims about life getting easier as it goes. Face your fear, conquer your fear. That which does not kill us makes us stronger, wrote Nietzsche. I thought I'd spent enough time in the Philippines to have squished all fear of it. After living here, plus 8 trips over the last 13 years, I've toughed out the heat, the traffic jams, the pollution, 2 minor car crashes. I've been to the places where drug users were executed by vigilantes. I've interviewed an activist who was hounded at home by a soldier who warned them to stop dissing the regime or die. I stayed cool on all those occasions. I thought I'd devise strategies. I'd learned to pass the auto stalemates by looking out the window and noting graffiti, adverts, or the arbitrary poetry of urban breakdown. Storm-dislodged hyacinths mantling the Pasig River, kids racing each other through a concrete pipe, abandoned diagonally across a Cubao backstreet. If there was nothing to see, I'd read a book or pen my own. Writers shouldn't be short of material in a mesmerising city like Manila. So why now am I in a taxi on Calian Avenue, Quezon City, shaking like machine gun recoil, battling for my breath, launching water down my torrid throat? Why has the soothing inner voice of curiosity, how interesting is this, how fascinating is that, declined into the gravelly tones of paranoia? Will I make my interview on time? Are my questions facile and white and privileged? Do I smell? Why is the hand fan strapped to the headrest in front of me only multiplying the amount of warm air rather than cooling me down? Will I have enough change for the driver at drop-off? Does the driver know where he's going? Am I going to die? A Philippine taxi with rear seat belts is as common as a good film starring Gerard Butler. These are rookie worries, or should be. Worrying about these worries only adds to the worry. It's a self-perpetuating process. Distraction is needed. Breathe in through the nose, out through the mouth. That's the advice. Easier said than done when a main symptom of my anxiety is imagining I can't breathe. But how imagined is it? I've been failing to quit smoking for a decade. I could have damaged my lungs. Mental and physical health are wedded, they say. That doesn't make me feel any better. What does work is beer. But it's 9:22 a.m. and that's not an option yet. I could warrant one at lunchtime with my interviewees. They'll see me gulp San Miguel and barely eat until I've drunk enough to stop freaking out about choking on food. That's another symptom. My interviewees shouldn't judge. They know the Western weakness for the source. If they do judge, I'll take the risk. I'll also risk feeling worse tomorrow from a hangover. But when anxious, I can only aim for short-term relief. I never learn. I'll stop there for now. Thanks. So that goes straight into what we call in creative writing in media res, straight into the action, straight into, I felt the need to kind of just, get right into kind of describing what it feels like to suffer from anxiety. And it's, if I just kind of start off with a few points of departure, just give it, I'm glad there's a few people who have read the book, but at the same time, I hope not to kind of bore you with stuff you already know. But the book is really structured around 3 big trips. Just for context, for about 20 years, over 20 years, I've been fortunate enough to travel the world as a travel writer and as a journalist. And many of my trips, even into kind of quite tricky situations, have been very easygoing. I've, despite kind of triggers that you would think would cause anxiety, I've managed to stay calm and cool. Other trips have not been so successful. It's very much a mixed bag, and part of the point of the book is to try and sort of solve that puzzle as to what these causes are, what these triggers are, and why some trips are successful and some trips have been catastrophically unsuccessful. So it's structured around 3 main trips, really. One to the Philippines, which I kind of started to read to you about there. And the other 2 were to Nigeria in recent years. And the trips to Nigeria were more there were more obvious kind of potential triggers for anxiety, right? Because the first time I went to get married in a traditional Igbo ceremony to my wife, Oge. And the second time I went to have IVF treatment to have a baby there. So, whereas the trip to the Philippines was actually quite easygoing. I was going to sort of meet some colleagues at an institution there, try and form a kind of relationship between University of Portsmouth, where I work, and this particular institution there. I was treated very well, given lovely food, great conversation. I find the Philippines a fascinating place, so I've been there very often. I'm working on my third book about the Philippines, that's how interested I am in it. And I could not make head or tail as to why I suddenly became incredibly anxious in this situation. There was nothing consciously or rationally there to kind of cause, as we know, anxiety is not a particularly rational situational state of mind to be in. So it's based around 3 trips. There are other mentions of trips that I've done elsewhere as kind of asides, but it's really is a structured around these 3 main trips. It's very autobiographical. There's more of me in this book than in any of the other books I've written, which might explain why it's had more interest in terms of publicity. I've done a lot of radio interviews and podcasts and written lots of guest blog posts and articles for the press and things like that. It might be because it's, as I say, it's quite personal, but also it's about mental health and anxiety, which are obviously very much part of the kind of zeitgeist of our culture at the moment. And I go back into my childhood, and I was that kind of archetypal, shy, nervous, anxious kid who would freak out if I lost sight of my mum in the supermarket. I was naturally like timid kid who wasn't very independent at all. And so for me, starting to travel was an effort to try and conquer that anxiety. Ironically, then getting into travelling then presented a whole new kind of roster of things to cause anxiety and panic. So it's a kind of complicated process. I was diagnosed with general anxiety disorder when I was 25. And this was in the again, there was sort of a number of reasons for that. I had partied quite a lot as a student. I'm kind of a hypocrite being an academic because I'm telling my students to work hard and do as well as they can. And between you and me, my first degree was I wasn't the best student that I wasn't the student I could have been. So I think I was dealing with the fallout from that. I think everybody at some point in their life has some kind of existential crisis, do they not? They just kind of worry about, what am I doing with myself? What is my life for? What am I going to do in the future? Who am I? Etc. And that kind of happened to me. Some people have that. They talk about midlife crisis. For me, it was a crisis in my mid-20s, And so that kind of, was a cause of sort of early anxiety. I met part of that existential crisis was to try and resolve that, was to travel more and also to become a writer and to do any kind of writing that I could to make a living. And there's sort of sequences in the book about those kind of early experiences of selling my soul, basically. Initially doing all kinds of copywriting and anything that would pay money, and then moving into stuff that was more interesting, like journalism and authoring books and stuff, which I was sort of fortunate to kind of make that progress. But there was quite a lot of living in poverty. Poverty causes anxiety and fear. How am I going to pay the rent? How am I going to feed myself, etc., etc. And I think the life of a freelance writer, a freelance journalist, is also I'm not the only one. I'm a very proud member of the National Union of Journalists, and I've done depositions to the NUJ, especially during COVID, to try and help defend freelancers and make life a bit easier for freelancers, because it's very, very stressful. It's a precarious line of work. You don't know where the next check is coming from or the next job is coming. Those were sort of early causes of anxiety, which I never really bothered to kind of analyse until I started writing a book like this, and it seemed to, there was a lot of sitting down and kind of trying to kind of beam my mind back into the person I was then, and then recreate that as faithfully as I could in the book, I also kind of started to, as I wrote the book, started to do more thinking about anxiety and what it is. I started to understand anxiety as a construct of time, place, culture, and identity. Just as I think generally people have different symptoms and experiences of anxiety. They may be unique to every individual to some extent. It's also true that people don't feel anxious in the same way in different cultures and different places. And I think historically, in different times, people, there is not necessarily a kind of common way of feeling anxiety. And in the book, there's a chapter where I try and reconstruct one of my ancestors on my mother's side, who was a Jewish gentleman called Emil Hollanders, who left what is now would now be the town of Kempen in Western Germany to move to Portsmouth, to emigrate here to what was one of the largest Jewish populations of any cities in the UK. It's the fourth largest population. We've had a record 7 Jewish mayors, I think, which is, I think, probably not even New York has had that many Jewish mayors, for example. And so I can't take I can take not much of the credit of this. I have relatives who kind of started to reconstruct my family history in recent years with the help of, ancestry type websites and the fact that a lot of public records, births, deaths, marriages, people getting on ships to cross the ferry, which was relevant getting on ships to cross the channel, which was obviously what Emil did when he was 20 years old in 1858. And I compare, in this chapter, I kind of imaginatively reconstruct his journey and compare it to the channel crossing that I did in 2018, which was kind of ruined by anxiety. And I try and look at the fact that I looked up, for example, how many shipwrecks there were in 1858 in the English Channel, and there were over 100. You think, really? Like that? It's not that big. It's like, how many must have there have been in the Caribbean or the North Sea that year? It seemed like I read about the risks inherent in getting, even on a relatively short trip, jumping on a sailboat in 1858, the diseases that you could have caught, smallpox and all kinds of wonderful stuff like that. And then I started to wonder what was going through his head, and his anxiety sort of in any way sort of ancestrally, is it in any way inherited or passed down? And I thought, and also, being a Jewish fella on a boat coming from an anti-Semitic society and coming to an anti-Semitic society, let's not forget, Britain at that time, if you were Jewish, you couldn't go to university because you had to be Christian. Certain jobs, such as being a member of parliament, were blocked from you. You were blocked from doing that. So he wasn't exactly coming into a very happy sort of multicultural, sort of caring, sharing society. But then at the same time, I was like, maybe he was a 20-year-old guy in Victorian times. Maybe he was having a whale of a time, and he may well have seen some whales on the way. Actually, I looked this up, so that, if he was lucky enough on certain days in the English Channel at that time, maybe he would have just had a perfectly good time of it and just seen it as an adventure, going, in that kind of Victorian boy's own sort of way. I'm off to start a new life. I'm going to meet a pretty girl. He married into a family of the Goldsmiths, who are kind of Jewish family already settled here, probably Goldsteins if you go further back. The only thing I was worried about when I was looking this up is I might be related to that awful guy Goldsmith. Remember? It's a Tory guy who stood for son of James Goldsmith, Zach Goldsmith, who had that rather unpleasant political campaign some years ago. People may or may not remember. So be careful what you kind of look for when you do this ancestry research stuff. So I was kind of thinking, like, what would have made someone anxious travelling in the 19th century as compared to today, and then being kind of feeling thoroughly ashamed of myself, being on a boat where there was a delicious buffet of French food, which I couldn't stomach because I was, anxious. And there was no risk of shipwreck, no risk of anti-Semitic abuse aboard, a P&O ferry in 2018, etc., etc. So it was I thought, it was quite interesting to sort of compare experiences or possible experiences. I've also had my fair share of visiting societies where there are different attitudes towards mental health. In Nigeria, when I was having this difficult time on the first trip that I kind of recount in the book, And again, my answer was not the best answer. It was to sort of start drinking as early as I possibly could, although my excuse was that I was getting married, you know, a sort of party vibe. But questions started to be asked by my in-laws, or my, you know, by soon-to-be in-laws. And it wasn't easy to explain anxiety. The first reaction that they had was like, is it something we've done? What have we done to offend you? No, it's nothing to do with you. It really isn't. And again, I was thinking, what am I... Rationally, this doesn't add up. I'm in a part of the world I love. I'm about to marry the love of my life. I love the food, I love the culture, I love the weather. Why am I feeling like this? You know, it's a puzzle. It's a puzzle that I try and solve in the book. I mean, when I first met my wife, she had certain preconceptions around mental health, and she said, and it's in the book, she said, yeah, my kind of you know, Nigerian girlfriends and I, who have sort of moved to the West, sort of said, yeah, don't date Western men because they've all got drink problems and they have mental health issues. And I was like, guilty as charged. But hopefully there's a bit more to me than that, you know. And you know, now we're happily married, so it kind of worked out right in the end. Why have I got a picture of Catwoman up there? Oh, I know, yeah. Because my mother-in-law, when she came to stay with us around the time my wife was pregnant with our daughter, who's now our daughter, I had a black cat, Lev. I could end up danger of getting morose because we had to get rid of Lev. And anyway, I'll try and leave that to one side. But black cats in rural eastern Nigeria are juju. They're black magic, you know. My mother-in-law, who, you know, again, it's the culture you come from, it's what you're used to, it's what you're conditioned to believe, sort of said, look, don't let the cat near my wife when she's pregnant because it might kind of, the baby may look like the cat when it's born. My response was, sounds fucking cool to me. You end up with a kind of Marvel sort of DC comic superhero kind of character. That did not go down very well. That was a faux pas. That kind of offended her and then caused a bit of caused anxiety. So there's that sort of anxiety that comes from cross-cultural encounters and misunderstandings between people. And I think, you know, anyone who's travelled quite a lot, it's kind of inevitable that you're going to get into those situations. The point is that you try and learn from them and do better next time. It was also really important to have the perspectives of people who weren't me in the book. So I'm really grateful to interviewees. Two of them are pictured there. That's my friend Anne Baho, who's also a colleague here. She's just finished her PhD, which is great, good for her. But she's a former defence analyst for the armed forces of the Philippines. Now, if I thought I'd had some anxious travels, being attacked by terrorists in the southern Philippines with guns and rockets, now that's proper travel that will make you properly anxious. And also Anne, it was important to speak to, you know, as a kind of male, able-bodied, not very fit, but able-bodied, heterosexual, white passing at least, partly Jewish, whatever, man, there's a lot of privilege when you travel abroad. There's a lot of, you have it easy relatively. From a young age, from when I first started traveling as a backpacker and, you know, like a lot of bozos my generation in my mid-20s, it quickly became clear that when you met a female solo traveller, there was a whole sort of other set of anxieties, usually unfortunately to do with the behaviour of men, harassment and creepiness and et cetera, et cetera. And so speaking to Anne and Victoria Leslie, who's another colleague, it was really important to get that kind of, you know, the female perspective on anxiety and, you know, and things that can trigger that men do not generally have to go through. Pip, you're here. I was just going to say very briefly, I don't know, maybe you can come in later. This is the last interview I conducted. So the interviews have carried on in a publication called The Intrepid Times. And Alan, I've interviewed you. I think it's like one big happy family, aren't we? Of people who have been interviewed about their travel anxiety. So yeah, there's some people in the room who I'm very grateful to them for bringing different perspectives on travel anxiety. So everyone's got their own story. The other thing as well is that when you write about yourself over a long period of your life, I'm 46 now, so it's almost the full length of my life that I'm kind of dipping into to tell this story, you realise that your kind of attitudes change according to your age and your situation and your experience. And I've just written a piece for Asylum magazine, a radical mental health magazine called The Politics of Travel Anxiety. And it's, I was just going to give you a quote from that because it comes out in June and it sort of, I suppose in a way kind of extends the story told in the book sort of in new directions. And it's really about thinking, I mentioned that I did the backpacking trail, you know, around Southeast Asia when I was younger. And I was kind of oblivious really to the sorts of ways in which kind of inequality and exploitation operate in the travel industry, right? So later on, when I'd kind of educated myself a little bit more and become more aware, I changed my view on that, you know, and ever since then it's been something that I've been quite critical about. So I'll just, as I put it in the article, since becoming a journalist and academic with a focus on decoloniality and global justice, I've realised that we backpackers unburdened ourselves of our anxiety only to dump it on the shoulders of the local people from Manila to Mumbai who toiled away for our pleasure, the cooks, waiters, cleaners, washerwomen, rickshaw and cab drivers. This was and still is but one way in which global inequality and uneven development manifest themselves in travel anxiety. So there are these kind of wider geopolitical conditions which filter down into the anxiety felt by people who are kind of working hard to make this sort of not for much money and being exploited to create a kind of paradise experience for kind of privileged Western white bozos like me. But there's also, you know, if you have any kind of sense of empathy or self-awareness, there would be feelings of guilt about that. You know, certainly it's something that, you know, since then it's, you know, I think it's those sorts of social relations are inevitable. Whatever culture you're in, there are those who exploit and there are those who are exploited, and so there are certain kinds of anxiety that kind of come out of that, I would argue. There's also travel anxiety that emanates from environmental matters, ecological matters. Flying, you know, it's one of those of us, you know, it's one of those, again, challenges, one of those tricky things, you know, when you, I've just to give you a kind of statistic here. Flying contributes to 2.5 to 3% of global carbon emissions, yet only 10% of the world's population, mostly in the global north, travel by aeroplane most years. So anyone who flies travels through, you know, by flying on a plane is sort of part of this tiny elite, if you like, of people who are causing this kind of environmental degradation. And it's a kind of source of guilt, and at least should be a source of kind of consideration or reservation for people. And I think there are other forms of anxiety that I deal with quite explicitly in the book, very much inspired by this excellent book by Colin Ellard, who is a kind of psychologist of place, psychologist of geography, if that's a thing. Thoroughly recommend the book Places of the Heart, the psychogeography of everyday life. And in that he talks about mental distress that can be caused by really the kind of, the development, you know, the built environments that human beings have kind of created for ourselves. Talks about the lack of neighbourhood cohesion in a lot of big cities, you know. Exposure to toxins or pathogens obviously have a kind of physical health impact, but can also have a mental health impact too. Shoddy planning, bad planning. Again, there could be all sorts of political and economic reasons for quickly building things badly to cut costs. We live in an age of seemingly endless austerity, which means that, as I say, has a kind of influence on the sorts of environments that human beings kind of design and create for themselves. Poorly managed traffic flows, buildings with jagged edges. So it's also the aesthetics and the kind of physical appearance of buildings and the built environment that can have this effect. Now, Ellard is someone who takes a very scientific approach to this. I mean, he literally is measuring people's blood pressure and the amount of adrenaline that they're generating as they stand and try and cross a road in Mumbai or New Delhi or Manila or some global southern megacity. So there's a kind of really interesting kind of hard scientific backing to this. But I think probably most people, whether you know the science or not, whether you read the book or not, you would probably accept that this is true. You know, that a lack of green spaces, green open spaces in a city is going to cause feelings of claustrophobia and misery and anxiety and so forth. But, you know, I think it's quite interesting that someone has, sort of taken this kind of scientific approach to proving that. As I say, it was a big influence on the book, and I kind of tested out some of these theories with my own, not that I rigged myself up and took my blood pressure as I walked around places like Manila, but I just started to, you know, dwell more on, especially the kind of visual and the aesthetic side of things, the jagged edges of, you know, we tend to feel more relaxed when we see curved roofs or curved brand names, for example, versus these kind of hard, spiky, jagged edges is what Ellard sort of comes to conclude. And I will just finish off really, just this last slide, last thing I wanted to say, about kind of what do we do about it? What do we do about travel anxiety? This isn't a self-help book at all. I mean, if you look to me as your guru, then you really are in a lot of trouble. I mean, I'm not professionally trained. It would be ludicrous for me to start dispensing any kind of medical advice. But, you know, but I'm one of these people who, you know, I've got personal experience. I've been a sufferer of this for a long time. So I do have insights which have helped me. And if they help others, so much the better. But I certainly wouldn't kind of foist them on anyone. I've learned grounding techniques. You know, I mentioned breathing in through your nose and out through your mouth. It's not an easy thing to do. It feels unnatural. It feels kind of annoying. But actually, if you do it, you get more oxygen into your brain. You start to relax and things start to, you know, seem less scary and anxious. I still can't pronounce this name. Mihály, but this is a guy who came up with the idea of flow states. I don't know if people have come across this, people who've read the book have, if you remember it. And this is the idea of doing what you need to do in order to sort of not be focused on your immediate surroundings and all the kind of risks and fearful aspects of what you're going through at that time. The classic example given is when, you know, as kids, if we went off and played and we just lost track of time, we were just stuck in this imaginary game of whatever soldiers or whatever people, and we had no kind of, we didn't register the outside world until, you know, our mum calls us in for tea or something at the end of the day, a long summer's day. People find flow states in adulthood from playing an instrument, from writing, from painting, from meditation. Anything that, as I say, kind of unlocks you from this kind of, you know, worrying about the here and now and immediate threats and immediate kind of aspects of life that might kind of, you know, immiserate you. Avoiding toxins of various kinds is important. I've learned far too late, I wish I'd learned this earlier, that you know, relying on having a few drinks, yes, in the short term, no, really in the long term, you end up with hang-anxiety, if people have heard of that term. I talk about a particularly nightmarish situation where, this was in the Philippines, where I'm feeling anxious and I think, that's all right, I'll just have a few beers, and the few beers just make it worse. And then I have another few beers, I think, what do? Do I get a bottle of whiskey? I don't get a bottle of whiskey, but it just becomes this, you know, I mean, I think, you know, it brings us back to that question of, you know, what is really ailing you? What is at the root of this anxiety that you might be suffering? And I think if there's something deeper, a deeper malaise than, you know, just, you know, that kind of means that you can't just, you know, drug yourself or, you know, anaesthetize yourself quickly out of that state of mind, then that's something that deserves a kind of, much more serious and kind of critical engagement with. I think the other thing as well is sort of accepting that anxiety and conflict are facts of life, and they give meaning not just to travel but to life. I like this quote from Tom Waits: "The obsession's in the chasing and not the apprehending, the pursuit you see and never the arrest." Think of stories in our culture. Something I'm very interested in as someone who teaches creative writing for his day job. Stories, think of any favourite story, think of a action film, romance, any genre. Think of an Indiana Jones film, since we're talking about. I wish my travels were half as exciting as Indiana Jones's, but then he had a lot of anxiety that I didn't have to fight Nazis and stuff, so that's seriously anxiety-inducing, one imagines. But I think Indiana Jones, it's all about that moment when he gets what he wants, when he gets the Grail or he gets the Lost Ark, gets the girl, whatever. That's a few minutes at the end. That's not what people are interested. That's not at the core of the story. What's at the core of the story is the conflict. It's him trying to get there. It's him overcoming. It's him fighting the Nazis, or it's him dodging out of the giant boulder as it rolls down, through the tunnel. And that's because stories like that, because life is like that. We need challenges. I think without some risk, without some conflicts, without challenges, without anxiety, I wouldn't have anything to write about. I wouldn't have had experiences to. The trouble is that at the time, and I've often felt like this, at the time when I'm feeling particularly anxious, I'm like, I will happily trade any advantage I can get, fee for selling this to a magazine, any kind of literary acclaim. If you can just make me feel a little bit better, please. I've made that kind of pact with whatever gods are out there many times, and it hasn't worked so far, So it's not. I'm not saying that it's an easy thing to rationalise when you are in the kind of swamp of panic at that time. You just want anything to make yourself feel better so you can function. But in the long run, you have to be sort of philosophical about it and see that without these hurdles, things lack meaning. I think just the final thing I wanted to say is back to that kind of point I was making about the politics of travel anxiety. It's the conclusion to this article I've just written, is that if we have anxious travel, it's because we have a society that's anxious. And it's made anxious, that's not just a natural law, or it's not just an accident. It's because of certain kind of, I would argue, political and economic conditions. We've got crises in the Middle East, as if that's anything new, but on sort of forever wars, genocides. We've got austerity that seems to go on and on and on. Inequality of various kinds, precarity of work. As someone who works with young people every day, this is kind of brought home to me, quite vividly, because it seems that there's really, there's a lot of anxiety and mental health issues amongst young people, and there's one of the obvious causes is that the world, the kind of society that they're kind of trying to adapt to and trying to flourish in is sort of not, there are certain kind of political decisions that have been made that have not made that society as sort of anxiety-free as possible. And I kind of cite a little bit of research that kind of, by people who investigated kind of labour and workplace sorts of conditions that in the book to kind of prove that point, really. So yes, I think I will just stop there, really. Some things, say some potential solutions. I think there are solutions that you can try or remedies that you can take on a personal level, but I think there are also decisions that we have to make as communities and societies to try and reduce anxiety, if at all possible. Thanks very much. That's it from me. So I don't know if anyone has any questions, or we've got a bit of time. Yeah, and
just a quick point on that last thing you're talking about. Do you think there's maybe a deliberate attempt to induce this sort of anxiety through these things as a controlling mechanism by the powers that ought not be?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, sort of an anxious workforce and an anxious populace are less likely to rebel or dissent. To the extent that it's some kind of plan or agenda. I don't know. I mean, I think it's a difficult one. I think, like debt. I think like debt is a kind of something that is a kind of huge millstone around a lot of people's necks, isn't it? That that you don't. You have to keep earning, you have to keep being in the kind of rat race to keep earning money to pay off the debt, and if you don't, then you're in trouble, you lose your house, and you could, and all kinds of awful stuff like that. I think unfortunately it's a sort of sort of product of the kind of societies and the economic models that we've that have been adopted. I think particularly like neoliberalism, in particular in the last sort of 40 or 50 years, is a particularly kind of virulent strain of this. Then anxiety is a product of that, and to the extent that it's sort of planned, I don't know, but it certainly benefits elites of certain kinds, you could say, definitely. Yeah, it's a good question. Oh, Dave, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, it's less a question, more a statement of fellow feeling, because like you, Tom, I was painfully shy, terribly shy, when I was a teenager at art college. I had an existential crisis about where I was going, what was life all about, because I had a very clear idea of what I wanted to do as a boy, but the more I worked and the more exams I went through, the further away I seemed to get from that. So I really rolled the dice to go to South Africa rather than Canada, because it seemed more dangerous, it seemed more of an adventure. And it was a way of taking back some control that was being taken further and further away from me. So, I mean, my early history was very like yours, actually, I think. I had some hairy times, certainly, which has probably come out in some of my writing.
Yeah, well, I think, control is it. I mean, I think, anxiety is often at the root of that is a sort of loss of control, isn't it, or fear of losing control. So I think anything you can do to try and retain that or hang on to that, and whether it's through becoming more, for me, I think it's trying to become more independent, generally, like I remember just walking to school on my own seemed like an amazing achievement, being a kind of shy, scared kid. I was 28 or something like that. No, I was a lot younger than that. So no, I agree. I think control is sort of quite a big idea around this, or lack of,
Lack of, I hope that came across to a description of siege conditions I went through in Cape Town. Remember,
you wrote about that.
More or less refought a Boer War battle. Minus the bullets. Ran out of money, was living on hardly anything. Anyway.
Sorry, Pip, did you have you had that book?
I'm intrigued by almost everything you've said, and that's not just because I know you. I think this is raising so many questions to me. I'm particularly interested to hear more, if there's time, about the cultural differences in which anxieties exist or are generated. You go to comparison with Nigeria, not having a concept that we would have recognised of anxiety like this. And I'm wondering if on your travels you come across societies that experience less anxiety or have less emphasis on it, and what they would have in common with each other.
Yeah.
Does that make...
Yeah, so the social psychologist Oliver James some years ago came to the conclusion, he sort of travelled the world and he did sort of psychoanalyzing people in different cultures, and he came to the conclusion that he quoted the Tears for Fears song, it's a mad world, but it's a mad English-speaking Western world. He found that we were the most prone to mental health issues for sort of social and economic reasons, but I think other cultural reasons as well. I mean, just with my experience in Nigeria, I'm not sure if there is less anxiety that kind of that appears, that sort of emerges from people's experiences. But I think there are different ways of dealing with it. So I think the kind of, there's much more of a kind of family and community oriented way of living. There's much more kind of religious belief, and sort of faith-based kind of responses to, if you're talking about sort of the existential crisis that a lot of people face, and is probably universal, perhaps a kind of a belief in a god or an ideology or a system, a code helps to alleviate that. I don't know what I'm kind of speculating a bit here really, but or perhaps it helps you repress it. If you want to get into psychoanalysis, you repress it and then it comes out in all sorts of kind of other maybe unhealthy ways, that it may not, that actually maybe having a panic attack it might actually be a kind of healthier alternative to repressing whatever kind of fear and pain you're suffering, and then it kind of manifesting itself in violence towards someone, or pursuing some kind of angry, bigoted political project or something, not naming names or anything, but you take the pick from our current geopolitical situation, can't you? So yeah, it's a really good. I'd like to know more about that, exactly that kind of question that you raised. Really, I'd like to do more research. Yeah. Claire, yeah.
I wonder whether you touched on this with the actual the anxiety of travelling itself. Because I don't know about you, but I've been travelling for a long time now, and I actually find the journey itself to be the most anxiety-inducing thing because of the way we're treated.
Yeah.
We are no longer passengers, we are something that gets in the way of them flying their plane from one place to the other. And if they can make more money out of us, then they will. And from what used to be a very pleasurable part of the journey, that's probably the thing that induces the most anxiety in me, is that build up to, oh God, I've got to get back on the plane again. Oh God, that's going to be awful. Am I going to get on the plane? Are they going to charge me more money to get? All of that kind of stuff. I mean, is that something that you've seen in your journeying?
Yeah, I deal with that quite a bit in the book. You're quite right. I mean, it seems to have got worse and worse, doesn't it? Like plane delays, plane cancellations. I talk about travelling after COVID, where it was just seemed, was it an excuse or a reason? Anyway, COVID was given as a reason for everything just being crapper than it usually is, staff shortages. And I don't think I've been searched and x-rayed so many times, between kind of one airport and another. Bus delays, train delays. I mean, there's no shortage of kind of just practical aspects of travel that make people anxious. My editor told me to cut this out because there were a few too many interactions with like jobs worth kind of bureaucrats, making you squirm before they give you the visa, or making you squirm on the border, and that's happened to me. That happens, being kind of cross-examined, especially when you have a kind of passport that has lots of odd stamps in it. In fact, coming back from on that trip I mentioned, coming on the ferry in 2018, and again there was a huge delay, and people were saying, well, Brexit has caused this huge kind of log jam, and so there are these other conditions that kind of fed into it potentially. But I remember I had I was quizzed for ages because I had a stamp from Tunisia, because I'd done a sort of press trip there, and I'd just done a bit of kind of commercial travel, right, and gone there for a couple of weeks. And I think there was this suspicion that, like, what are you? In Tunisia, it's a Muslim country. What were you doing there? Are you a spy? Are you a terrorist? It was just ridiculous. And we were holding everyone. I was just like making myself so unpopular, or the bureaucrat was making us unpopular, because we were just holding up this huge fleet of people desperate to get back into Portsmouth after their holiday. And there's and there's obviously a lot of fear of flying. A lot of people hate flying, and even though it's statistically safer than driving, yet not many people have that kind of fear of driving when they travel. So what's that about? Perception and reality. What's the difference? But yeah, Emil?
Yeah, I just like comment on the idea of control and losing control and anxiety. Because couldn't you argue that anxiety doesn't necessarily come from the idea of fearing losing control, but believing that control is the ultimate state that is desirable. Because as you say, the main exciting part of the Indiana Jones film is not when he reaches the state of control, it's the chase. And similarly, when we believe that control is the ultimate state we want to, we fear not having it. But could you not then argue that maybe anxiety is something that you can not read yourself off, but anxiety decreases once you start accepting that maybe control isn't what I want in life, and rather accept that life, I can't control life, but that means that I just have to deal with it.
Yeah.
In one sense, because for me, just feeling like my main goal in life is to reclaim control is kind of a way it's similar to alcohol, it's a way to push away the actual problem of accepting that life can't be according to what I want it to be. Because life is very pure and fluid and not determined.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, I think, accepting uncertainty and accepting that you can't control things is a sort of important lesson to learn, definitely. Yeah. I think my own experience, I feel like I've done that in various kinds of situations that have been objectively quite dangerous and challenging, but then I'm back to square one on the next trip when something that isn't, a relatively straightforward trip is suddenly mired in anxiety again. It's a for me personally, it's kind of conundrum. But I think that's probably what we should be aspiring to. I think who was it? Was it Keats, the poet, called it negative capability, being comfortable with not knowing and being uncertain and sort of not worrying that you may not understand. He was talking about the kind of wonders of nature and the sublime, and it's like you're never going to understand the beauty and mystery of a kind of mountain or a waterfall, so just accept that and roll with it and try and enjoy it, kind of thing. So maybe it's that's got maybe links to kind of what you're saying. Yeah. Thank you, good point.
Tom, thank you. I really enjoyed reading your book.
Thank you.
From my perspective, I find the Nigerian aspect really interesting because it seems like throughout your life you've been battling with anxiety. You've tried various therapies and different ways of dealing with it. But from my reading of your book, it's not until you go to Nigeria that you're actually combating, if you like, real problems. Real problems that are real anxieties because they're to do with your actual physical health, physical life. And then it seems that from your marriage and from the birth of Mara, that you enter this state of much more calmness. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, it seems like a bit of a kind of pat sort of ending, doesn't it? That getting married and having a child will, it's a bit like the end of a Shakespeare play kind of thing, isn't it? Everyone gets married despite all the murders and intrigue that's gone on. But yeah, it's true, and I think it probably helped to answer the kind of early existential crisis and uncertainty and like, what am I doing with myself? And coming to marriage and fatherhood pretty late in life, relatively speaking. And that last, in order to achieve some kind of sort of equilibrium, there was that last kind of, doing IVF treatment is stressful enough, but doing it in Lagos, Nigeria is kind of, I don't make these things easy for myself, but it's almost like if you achieve that, then I like to think that, you've kind of, it's like conquering Everest or something. It doesn't mean that you've kind of, and that's it, you can relax and be complacent. Because there are steps forward and there are steps backward, and I can't say, I've had anxiety episodes, not severe ones, but I've been anxious since then, so I haven't completely conquered it. But it's progress in dribs and drabs. And I think for me, you'll know this because you read the book, finding out belatedly that there was only a 5 to 15% chance of IVF working on the first go was like, if I'd known that earlier, we probably wouldn't have, it's my bad research, so I probably wouldn't have bothered. But but then that feeling like an extraordinary hurdle and the fates being completely against you to kind of overcome that has, So I mean, there is a kind of natural. I think that's why probably I felt like I had to write this book now and tell this story, because there's a sort of natural arc there. There's a sort of where I came from as a crazy mixed up kid to arriving at some kind of equilibrium and sort of sort of comfort or sense of balance as a result of these things that have happened to me very recently, just in the last few years. So, thank you. Good question. How are we doing for time? Maybe time for one more question. Then, did you want to do a little outro and?
Yes.
Yeah.
If there's not another question from the floor, I guess I'm interested in kind of what's next. You've already spoken about some of the articles that you're writing kind of alongside it. I'm interested in what's next for you after kind of the push for this book is over.
I've got to hurry up and start writing a completely different kind of book, which is more aligned to my kind of academic interests, which is a kind of history book, really, looking at trying to, using declassified documents and FOI requests and sort of previously unavailable information to try and tell the untold story of Western support for sort of two phases of autocracy in the Philippines, so the Marcos dictatorship in the 70s and 80s, and more recently the Duterte regime. So I'm kind of like, it's a bit like, you're at the swimming pool, you should jump in the deep end, and you're kind of, for 6 months I've been kind of, I don't really want to do this. So I've got to get into that in the summer. So that's due in January. But in terms of a book like this, I've also just pitched to the same publisher, Icon, a book called, I'm really happy with the title, any J.G. Ballard fans here? Yes, good. It's called The Austerity Expedition. Atrocity Exhibition, I know, a bit obscure for people maybe. And it's I want to work with a photographer friend of mine, Alex Sebley, who I worked with on a kind of travel guide, the only English language travel book ever written about Ivory Coast, and it's by me. And he's a photographer, and we worked together on that about 12 years ago, and we're going to work together on this book, which is basically we're going to travel around Britain, try and understand the cost of living crisis and try and understand the kind of precarious work. We want to talk to people who are kind of unusually frugal. I'm trying to track down a guy, if anyone can help, in Portsmouth. Over the years, I've been bumping into a guy who comes into the libraries here, who hasn't bought anything since like 1995. But he goes to the library, reads for free, uses the internet for free. I think lives from food banks. Does anyone know? I'm beginning to wonder whether I just hallucinated this. But I used to bump into him a lot and chat with him, and I've been trying to. I have friends who work in the libraries here, but they, so I'm asking them to keep a lookout for him. But there's obviously data protection stuff, so they can't necessarily tell me. So I want to sort of talk to people like that. Alex had this idea of travelling to somewhere like Jersey to meet some really wealthy, tax-evading so-and-so, and just spend some time with them and look at the life they lead, and then compare that to spending some time with someone who is perhaps, on universal credit and is struggling on, benefits, basically, and just to, get a kind of look at, I'm not an economist, nor is he. So, it's not that kind of expertise, but it's using sort of, travel and reportage and journalism to try and understand a kind of an economic situation that then might hopefully translate into something that people, that the sort of ordinary reader will be interested in. So we're just waiting to hear back as to whether Icon are going to go for that. And if they do, then we'll be, we want to do things like try and find where the cheapest pint of beer is in the whole of England. Not as a kind of listicle kind of thing, but just what is that pub like? Who are you going to meet? What kind of experience will that lead to? And the cheapest hotel room, and the cheapest journey, the cheapest meal. Be nice to try and on the other end of that scale, sample the most expensive meal. I don't think the budget's going to stretch to that, unfortunately, but anyway, yeah, so that's kind of what's hopefully coming next. But, yeah.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm sure we would all be interested in hearing each of those projects as they kind of develop over time, and I'm sure we would very happily have you back and to continue talking. So I wonder whether you just give Tom a thanks in the normal way of.
Thank you as well for brilliant questions and contributions. You know, it's really, you know, I'm just one voice, one opinion in this, so it's good to hear others. Absolutely.
By way of official outro, as it were.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Very much for me, but we've got 2 events coming up in Oxford over the next couple of weeks. We've got a talk by. I've written the name in my own handwriting and I can't shout around, but I can read the title. The title is How We Can Manage the Potential Damage and Impact